tax reform discussion here at the state level in Missouri is an important one because we're looking for ways to make Missouri more economically competitive with surrounding states. If we're more economically competitive, that's going to be better for the people and the businesses here in the state. So a few weeks back, I unveiled a new tax plan, which is the Missouri Economic Relief Act, and we've been working very hard to talk about the different components of that tax bill. But what we're here to talk about this morning is the fact that not only has that discussion really begun to take place in the Senate side, it's now begun to start to take place on the House of Representatives side. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce the individual that's going to be sponsoring the Missouri Economic Relief Act over on the House side, Representative Travis Fitzwater. So Travis, come on up.
Thanks, Senator.
Thanks for being here.
Yep.
It's your show.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about this. A couple weeks ago when I saw Senator Eigel's tax reform bill and I looked through the components of it, it was very appealing. And so I contacted Senator Eigel and I said, hey, can we talk about what's in this bill, what's involved? And it has a number of components I think are important that I've talked about since I've been in the legislature that I think are important to the tax discussion. And a lot of them individually are next to impossible to get done, as we've seen in the legislature. A number of them are the streamlined sales and use tax to ensure that retailers across the state are in a competitive environment. The infrastructure spending, the gas tax, that's a part of this, an increase in the gas tax, so that we're taking care of our infrastructure in the state. These things in and of themselves are very, very hard to get done by themselves. But when you have a plan that's comprehensive like the Senator has come up with, it was very appealing to be a part of it. The tax credit reform discussion was very important. I've been a proponent of tax credit reform since I've been in the legislature, and I'm thrilled that Senator Eigel has that as part of his bill, and I'm thrilled to carry it in the House side. And at the heart of this also, and Senator Eigel has mentioned this a number of times, is we have a budget that continues to grow. We're record numbers on our budget, and in just a couple years, we've increased that budget by magnitude of 30–40%. It's an incredible increase in our budget. And what do our taxpayers in our local districts, are they saying that they're really proud of what they're getting out of those increases? And so really wanted to look at that and say, how do we give relief to Missourians and ensure that we're not continuing to have these record numbers without giving relief back to the citizens in Missouri? And so that's what we're trying to do here, on top of ensuring that this is a calculated reform. This isn't just a haphazard, let's cut taxes and that's it, without any vision going forward. But let's cover a multitude of issues that we all agree are issues in and of themselves that can't get done in and of themselves, and try to come up with a plan that's comprehensive enough where you can get all the pieces done in one big package. And so I'm excited that this is a start to the tax reform discussion. This is probably by no means the perfect bill that's going to get passed as is, but we're going to have a long discussion about what this looks like. I know I have colleagues in the House and the Senate that have their own proposals. I talked to the governor's office yesterday. They also have a proposal coming out. And so we have a lot to discuss on tax reform. And with the federal government doing their own tax reform package that many of us in the legislature hope gets done because we think it's major relief for individuals in our state, there are some pieces to that impact our budget in a significant way. And that this bill also handles that, decoupling our deduction levels from the federal government allows us to ensure that our budget isn't impacted in a significant way. So with that, Senator Eigel and I would love to take some questions. Senator Eigel has details upon details on this package, but I'm thrilled to be filing this bill on the House side, and I look forward to the discussion going forward.
Was Speaker Richardson and Senator Richard involved in these discussions, and does this proposal have their support and leadership support as well?
I think from my perspective, I can't speak to the Senate, but I can speak from our Speaker. He's been a proponent of these conservative reforms. He hasn't given me any indication whether or not he'd support it, but I know he wants to start the conversation on tax reform. And with these pieces in it that have infrastructure spending, a gas tax increase, it's kind of this conservative conglomeration of ideas that allow you to decrease people's tax rates while also ensuring that you can spend money on infrastructure. You can spend money when you can put money into the budget from tax credit reform. These things are really crucial that the Speaker in and of themselves are issues that I know he wants to have a conversation on.
Has there been any discussions with
Sorry, if you want to speak to the Senate side.
I was going to speak to the Senate side real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. We have brought Senator Richard into that discussion. In fact, I first put this bill before my Senate colleagues in the Republican caucus at our winter meetings a couple months ago. So he's heard a full in-depth description of the bill. And actually, I think I saw a press release from Senator Richard's office last week, or a quote from Senator Richard himself, that said that fixing Missouri's broken tax code was one of his top priorities. So I'm confident that he's going to be very engaged, and he's supportive of that discussion. So.
For both of you, any discussions with the House budget or the Senate Appropriations Committee chair about what they think on it?
So I spoke to our budget chair, Representative Scott Fitzpatrick, just yesterday about this and kind of get his vibe on it. This is a very comprehensive plan. So it's hard to lay out in a short conversation, my first conversation with Scott on this particular issue, everything that that's going into it. But Scott is a fiscal conservative, and as one of our, in my opinion, in the many years I've been involved here in Jefferson City, one of the best budget chairs. He's very, very thoughtful, and he's very conservative. He's very fiscally sound. So I think that it's very appealing as a whole, but as far as saying I'm signing off on this, certainly it doesn't get done in the House. I'm not battling a Scott Fitzpatrick in the House to get something like this done. So Scott is going to have to be on board, I think, with really looking at the numbers and saying these make sense without busting our budget. And I think this reform package does a really good job, is very thoughtful in ensuring that we're not doing a Kansas-level tax cut. We're very thoughtful about how we're managing the revenues compared to the cuts.
It looks like this ultimately could, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Same answer, similar answer on the Senate side. That's Senator Dan Brown. Dan Brown was a part of the meeting in the Winter Caucus meeting where I presented this tax proposal. He was supportive of the idea and a discussion about tax reform. And again, something that Travis just said, I don't think the problem is going to be really convincing our Republican supermajorities that this is a discussion that we need to have and that we need to move forward on. So I'm very confident that he's going to be engaged in that discussion, and I look forward to it.
Revenue's been down recently. How does this bill make sure that it doesn't continue downward or even more dramatically downward?
Well, when you say revenues are down, what could you? State revenues are actually up. State revenues are actually up about 8% over last year, and they're actually at record revenue levels right now. We have a little under a $28 billion budget, which means that this coming year, and just like last year, we'll be spending more taxpayer dollars in the state of Missouri than we ever have before. So I would disagree with the assessment that our revenues are down. Could you be more clear about that?
A year ago, there was a need to cut back on the budget because of a reduced number of revenues. Did that change?
So, well, I think that we have to be clear what's going on here. So let me say that again. One, our revenues are at record levels right now. We've never had more general revenue come into the state coffers than what's come in right now. Now, you're talking about the withholds that the governor pursued at the beginning of this year, and Governor Greitens and Governor Nixon before him. Understand that when we create our budgets each fiscal year, we appropriate money to include a certain amount of increase. Now, when that amount of increase doesn't come into the level that we hoped for, then you have to cut back. But that doesn't change the fact that in spite of that, we're still spending record amounts of revenue. So revenues are very strong. They're up, like I said, 8% this year over last year, and we have a record amount of money. And I think that, one of the frustrations that I've heard from a lot of my constituents is that in spite of record amounts of revenue, they feel like they're getting less and less from government every year. I think that's the message that we continually hear on Election Day, where folks are expecting their government to be more efficient with their dollars and to continue to provide similar services without continually asking for more and more taxpayer dollars.
And I think right now, too, you're getting, everybody's receiving their property tax bills, and they're writing these checks to their local jurisdictions, and they're feeling, as I felt when I got mine, is, are we getting the best bang for the buck when we're sending this money in? And I think that's the important discussion we're trying to have, is how do we ensure that Missourians are getting as much of their hard-earned dollars that they've earned back in their pocket?
Missourians have heard for weeks more money back in your pocket, more money back in your pocket. That's all Washington has talked about. This seems more oriented toward protecting the state budget than it does returning the taxpayer. Sell me as a taxpayer on why I should care about this bill.
Sure.
Why I should support it.
Well, the reason I think that any Missouri worker should care about this bill is because right now that Missouri worker, from a variety of different tax sources, be it income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, are sending more of their money to Jefferson City than they ever have before. So the burden that we're placing on the Missouri taxpayer has never been greater than it is right now. Now, I'm a big believer that we can make our government a bit more efficient, that we can do a better job with the money that's coming in, and we can actually ease that burden on the Missouri taxpayer. So if you're a working or middle-class household, well, one of the components of this bill is it's going to eliminate the bottom 4 brackets in the Missouri State Income Tax Code. That's going to hit the bottom line of virtually every every single working household in the state of Missouri. If you're a small business owner, you make a little bit higher, then you're also going to see a pretty big drop in your income tax as well. So when you're creating those jobs, when you're investing in the equipment and the people that are making your business work, this is a great deal for you. But I think the message has to go back to the fact that we've never asked so much from the Missouri taxpayer, and this is an opportunity tied along with the federal tax reform discussion where we can return some of those assets and alleviate some of that burden for the households that are struggling to make ends meet every single year.
Fair to say then that Washington's plan is you're going to have more. Your plan is you're not going to have less.
I think that we're going to restore some of the record amounts of burden being placed on Missouri taxpayers that are coming into the coffers in Jefferson City. So you're going to keep more of your money because you've already been asked to pay record amounts of sums to Jefferson City.
The way that I read this, it looks like if if revenues stay the same based on the previous fiscal year or increased by any amount, there'd be a 0.1% decrease in the income tax.
That's correct.
Would this eventually completely eliminate the state's income tax?
If we keep growing as a state, as we have, and the government keeps growing the size that it is, we believe that there ought to be an incentive to taxpayers, and that's what we're doing with that. So yes.
Yeah, in fact, we took a look at that. So there's an initial drop in the income tax rate from 5.9% down to 4.8%, and then in additional years, as long as revenues maintain their current level from the previous year, it would continue to reduce by 0.1%. So as we slowly phase out from the income tax and move more towards other income sources, that's going to make Missouri more competitive. If you look at the states around the country that are growing right now, you're talking about states like Texas and Tennessee and Florida, and typically those states have one thing in common that I believe is a major driver of their population growth, and that is the lack of a state income tax. So yes, over the long term, and it is a long term, in fact, to fully phase it out, it would be almost the year 2070. So we have to go about this in a reasonable, slow, thoughtful manner, which we have, but yes, over the long term, this would eliminate the income tax in the state of Missouri.
And by the way, other parts of the bill, we're broadening the base and making it a more fair tax code. I think that's important too. The pieces of it that streamline sales and use tax, we have tax credit reform, so we're not giving out these tens of millions of dollars to large corporations who only a certain part of our population even has access to. We're doing a number of things. The retailers, you pay 2%, you get a 2% rebate for paying your taxes on time. I don't get that as a resident. We're changing that. So we're making the tax code more fair and more broad, which helps ensure that if we're growing, that taxpayers get more of their hard-earned dollars back in their pocket.
Missouri NEA said federal tax changes to the federal tax code could decrease general revenue budgets by $700 to $900 million every year. Do you have any concerns about how the changes to the federal tax code could impact the state budget, and was that a driving force behind this plan?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, maybe Senator Eigel can speak to it, but I don't foresee that being the case.
Well, and I think what that speaks to is that's the concern about over the doubling of the standard deduction that's currently part of the federal tax bill. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. So what our bill also does is decouple our standard deduction from the federal tax code. So as part of this discussion, one of the elements that we've added is a protection so that we don't have unforeseen consequences to our short-term budgets here in the state of Missouri, and that would be just one more issue or concern that's addressed by this particular bill.
Is that a recent addition though, also?
It's in the bill that I pre-filed. So it's a recent addition in as much as I added it after I found out that the federal tax bill would address this, but it is in my pre-filed bill currently.
This also looks like it could raise taxes by eliminating the Missouri income tax deduction for taxpayers' federal income tax liability. I guess overall, would a taxpayer see an increase in taxes, decrease, or same amount?
Well, so that's a really good point. So overall, the broad picture of this particular bill is that it's going to lower the tax burden on Missouri families and households and businesses. Now, there are certainly elements of this particular tax bill that adjust or make adjustments to our revenue that increase revenue. In fact, you just pointed out one of them. So you're correct. We're closing the federal income tax deduction loophole, which would raise revenues. But when you take into account the benefit Missouri households are getting from the reduction in the income rate, the elimination of the bottom 4 rates of the income tax code, it's a net gain for Missouri taxpayers. So and I think Travis hit on a really important point. There are many elements, and that's one of them. There are many elements in this bill that, as a standalone item, would probably never make it through the legislature. The elimination of a loophole, the streamline of the tax code, the increase in the adjustment upwards of the fuel tax. These are items that, by themselves, probably don't have much good chance to make it through Republican supermajorities in either chamber. However, we've created a bill that's a big idea made up of several other big ideas, and the only way they work is if they do so together.
What you just brought up is actually a fairly big burden on the taxpayer, because it raises what you were telling me, $590 million towards bringing it back to
That's correct.
neutral. Okay, and do you know how much that is per household that they're going to have to be paying back with the loss of the federal income tax deduction?
They don't lose the federal income tax deduction as it is right now. We keep it where it is right now in Missouri, so you don't see any change if we decouple from the federal government's tax reform bill.
I think he's talking about the 2 different issues. You're talking about, could you say that again? I apologize.
Well, this was the federal deduction that raises $590 million.
Right, that you claim on your state return.
Yes.
Yes. If we close that, for incomes in Missouri, or individuals in Missouri, excuse me, that would actually increase revenues by about $590 million. However, the gain that taxpayers see from the reduction in the income tax brackets and the elimination of the 4 brackets are significantly more than that. I think we covered that in your last interview as well. So again, on its own, a closing of the federal income tax deduction at the state level is never something that I would consider on its own, because that's a tax increase by itself. But when done as part of a broader tax reform measure, it does 2 things. One, simplifies the code, because we've eliminated one more deduction or one more loophole that certain income taxpayers take advantage of to a different degree. But at the same time, we've been able to move forward a broader tax discussion that lowers rates for everybody and makes that tax code more simple.
How close is it now to revenue neutral?
It's very close, and depending on what assumptions you use, you get very close to revenue neutral in the first year. And that was by design, because we wanted a small impact to our short-term budgets, but long-term, we're talking about eliminating an income tax in the state of Missouri that's bringing in revenue of a little over $5 billion. So when this is fully implemented in the year 2068, we're going to see a pretty significant cut to the tax bill of our populace.
But still be under by about $150 million in the first year.
Roughly, yes. That's what we talked about before. Yes.
Missouri's tax code hasn't been updated since 1931.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you believe that this is the best approach and not, say, the approach of Senator Eigel, who's also proposed his own plan?
Well, I think that part of the answer is in the question right there. We haven't updated our tax code since 1931, and quite frankly, this would be the largest tax cut that we've seen in the state of Missouri ever in the state's history. So part of the reason why the discussion is important to have now is because, as I mentioned earlier, we're sending a record amount of taxpayer dollars to Jefferson City, and the burden on the Missouri taxpayer has never been greater than it is right now. So the discussion has never been more relevant to every single person that lives in the state of Missouri than it is right now. So I think it's a great time, and also we've taken advantage of the fact that the federal government is having a discussion about how do we reform our tax code so that it can better, one, meet the needs of the citizens around the country, but at the same time not imply and put a burden that's so heavy upon the populace that we're stifling economic growth.
And another piece too, by the way, just a couple years ago, our legislature in Missouri did change the income tax to be reduced in a calculated way. I thought it was a very good bill when it was done, but there was all this argument that it was going to be this boondoggle for the state. Well, we switched over to a 5.9% from 6.6% this year because our revenues were high enough. So we're already seeing some of that income tax changing in our state anyway. We're just trying to build a calculated effort to expand that.
As a legislative strategy, though, recent history suggests different than what you're talking about. There was the Chamber of Commerce Fix 6, which had to kind of go piecemeal in order to be successful. There was the ethics reform, which was a very big thing, and then had to break down into little things. People get scared of size. They get scared that something's in there they're not going to see. Are you swimming against a current here in taking this approach?
Yeah, Kermit, that's a great question, but I think that that there are so many people that want the individual pieces to be done in this bill. And I think that's the carrot we're trying to put out there, is that it's a calculated, thoughtful, comprehensive bill. So you have, if you're an infrastructure wonk, you have your gas tax increase. If you want tax credit form, you've got that. So the governor's office is thrilled with that discussion. You have folks in the Senate that want to, or in the House, they want a fair and balanced environment for our local retailers who are, I have some of my own district business owners that are sick and tired of people coming into their business and then going and getting a 10% discount by buying something online. You have, we're broadening the base. We're doing a lot of things that in and of themselves can't get done. They can't get done. When Senator I sat down and talked for the first time, he said some of these pieces in and of themselves, if they came over as individual bills to our chamber, I would filibuster them. So you have to have an approach that is a big idea, a big thoughtful idea, because I think this is the best way to attract everybody to the table and say, hey, listen, you're getting your piece. Let's do this smart approach to tax reform in a way that doesn't bust our budget and that is intelligent, but handles a broadening of the base, but gives back Missouri taxpayers our hard-earned dollars.
And I would add to that as well. I acknowledge sometimes the more difficult nature of trying to pass a bill that has a lot of big items in this. But I'll tell you what, I don't know any of my constituents that are afraid of having the General Assembly tackle big ideas. And this was, if there's any message that I can pull away from every election day that we experience, it's that the voters are very interested in precisely those big ideas that are really going to change and reform the way our state does business. So you're right, there are certain political decisions that have to be made about what can be passed and what cannot be passed. Almost every politician that I know gets elected to public office on the promise that they have the big ideas that haven't been able to pass in the past. So the discussion that Travis and I are having are precisely about that. Is it going to be easy? Of course not. But I made a commitment, I believe Travis made a commitment to his constituents that we were going to come down here and fight for these ideals, and I can't wait to get started.
So the income tax that had already been passed in Missouri is set to start taking effect next year. We haven't yet seen the budget impact of that. Just why do this now versus waiting to see how something we've already put in place is going to have an impact on our budget?
Well, part of it too is this decoupling piece. It's almost we have to do something, or we're going to have this huge hole in our budget to at least think for that. And on its own, there's probably not a path for that to be done on its own. I mean, the discussions I've had, doesn't look great for a bill of that nature going on its own. So having this discussion on federal tax reform, how we're going to handle that in the state is crucial, and that's a piece of this.
So then does that become the biggest element right there for this whole plan?
I think you'll probably have everybody say there's a different big element to them.
If
You
it
know,
would be $1 billion or 700 million or 90 million or whatever.
I mean, it's obviously a huge chunk.
Well, as you mentioned, Jason, there's a lot of big pieces in this bill. So I don't know if you can just pull out one big piece and say that's the main piece that we're going after. If I had to decide what the big piece was, I would say the big pieces were reducing the tax burden on the Missouri public. So whether that comes about because we're decoupling some of the elements of a tax code that the federal folks in DC have passed, whether that's reducing the income tax rates, whether that's doing a number of the different things in the bill, the big idea here is that we're going to reduce the tax burden on the Missouri working households and businesses there in the state. I want to go back to your question a little bit, and your question was, should we wait to see what the impacts are of the last tax bill that was passed a few years ago? Well, I can tell you this, even though that tax bill was passed, as I've said before, we have record revenues in the state. We have record revenues in the state, and that 0.1% reduction that takes effect this year is actually going to be an amount less than what our increases have been this year. So our increases in general revenue have been 8% this year, which is actually less than what that tax bill will impact moving forward. So because our revenues are at record levels, I think the time is right now to have this discussion. I don't think we need to wait anymore because the burden is only going to get more, it's only going to get heavier on the Missouri public.
The 8% increase you're mentioning, though, we're not even fully through the fiscal year, so it's unclear whether or not that's going to remain that or eventually the revenues are going to decrease.
If you look at the past 10 years, the past decade of Missouri revenue increases, they have increased on an average about 4 to 4.5%. So you're right. We haven't gotten all the way through the year, although I would tell you that 8% is a pretty high number. It's looking pretty good. Now last year, you're right, last year the increase wasn't quite as much. I believe it was about 3%.
Yeah.
It was about 3% last year. Now 3% would also be an amount of money, amount of increase that would be greater than what we expect to lose when the last tax bill kicks in. So I don't think that there should be any concern that the state's not going to have enough money, because right now the state has a record amount of money, and not just general revenue, but the state has access to a record amount of federal dollars that it's also spending as part of its budget. If you go back to 2010, our revenues here in the state of Missouri have grown by 1/3. So the question is not whether we have enough money. We have enough money coming into Jefferson City. We've never had more. It's time to have a discussion about how do we ease some of that record-breaking burden that we are placing on the Missouri public. And we're excited to get started, and that'll happen on January 3rd.
And again, it's important to know that this is just a tax cut. This is a comprehensive bill that has a number of measures in it that, for the most part, balances itself out over the long term.
Several groups, when the Missouri Housing Development Commission voted for the full funding for the housing tax credit, expressed dismay, thought this would disproportionately impact people, low-income people, poor people. Why was the decision made to cap the low-income housing tax credit under your bill?
It's not just a cap on lower-income housing. There's a complete cap on tax credits in this bill of $425 million. So it wasn't just low-income housing, which I believe is about a $200 million cap now, which some of us believe that's way too high. But this is a negotiation piece. I don't think the tax credits are just going away overnight. You can see it if you're in this building. You know that it's not going away overnight. So we want to do something that's reasonable, reduce the amount, ensure that we're being smart with those dollars and not just giving them away to people that don't have access to them.
But just for clarification, you have no concerns about how this might impact poor communities or minority communities as well, people that live in these low-income housing units?
Well, if you look at the dollar for dollar, what we're getting out of those tax credits, it's not the best use of those dollars. I spoke to the governor's office yesterday. They mentioned they believe it's a 55-cent on the dollar per dollar that we give in. That's not a great return. When you're getting a little more than half of what you're putting into something, we're not helping poor people by doing that. So we want to use those dollars, put them in infrastructure, put them into education, put them into something that is going to empower those communities, as opposed to the system that we lose 45 cents on a dollar. That's not a great use of public dollars.
If I could make a comment where, as I said before, and I've said many times in this press conference so far, the amount of money that we're spending at the state level has never been more than it is right now. And the primary beneficiaries of those dollars that we're spending are our commitments to education, are our commitments to helping those that are less fortunate than us, our commitment to helping Medicaid program, which Medicaid is 40% of our budget. We've never spent more on Medicaid programs, and yet that primarily benefits those that are less fortunate than probably everybody in this room. So our commitment to lower income, struggling households has never been greater. Now, I think that there's general consensus in the General Assembly right now that we need to take a broader look at tax reform. The governor took a step forward on that, but the governor's decision to cut off the LIHTC program for this year can only address that particular tax credit program, and it's only a decision that can be made every year so long as he's governor. So what we're doing is we're pairing that tax credit discussion, which we've wanted to have in the state for a long time, along with our broader tax reform discussion, and I think Travis hit on a lot of the points. We think that we could make that program work a little bit more efficiently for the taxpayer. We don't have to spend quite so many dollars on that, and we're going to reform those tax cuts or those tax credit programs with an overall aggregate limit of $425 million.
You said you were speaking with the governor's office earlier. Does the governor's office support this legislation?
They want a tax reform discussion. Obviously they're not going to give a commitment on a pre-filed bill that's this comprehensive. They want to know more about it. They've been very, very interested and had great conversations with both me and the senator's office. But they're not giving a commitment at this point, but they do want to have the discussion.
2 more questions.
Or no more. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate you all.
Did you have one? Okay. Yes, go ahead.
There's no fiscal note yet published online on this. Where are you getting the data to show exactly how much each piece of this might be costing?
I've been researching our budgets in this bill for the past 6 or 7 months. So my office, Jacob Scott, my chief of staff, and I have been working very hard to come up with these numbers. So I'm looking forward to the fiscal note. I think the fiscal note is going to give a message that's along the line of what we're saying, and that is that in the short term, this is a modest way to reduce the tax burden on the Missouri public, and over the long term, this is really going to transform the state from an income tax state to one that's competitive with the states that are growing like Texas and Tennessee and Florida.
You know why we don't have
One more question, please.
I'm sorry?
Well, why didn't, we don't have a fiscal note yet, you know what, why don't we?
I think we're going to see it any time. We requested that fiscal note about 3 weeks ago, so I think we'll see it very soon.
It's just because it's a complicated bill, there's a lot in it.
There's a lot in it.
There is a lot of
And really quick before we're done, I want to recognize my colleagues in the House that are here. Representative Cherie Tolson-Rice, who's over here on my left, and Representative Chuck Basie. Really appreciating them coming down here and being with us in this conversation.
One more thing. Do you think that you could attract any businesses from high-tax states like California and New York to the area that are looking to relocate to lower-income tax states when the income tax is?
Absolutely. And again, if you look at the states that are growing right now, when you have population and growth in a state, that is a huge change mechanism. The population in Missouri, as everybody here knows, is very stagnant right now. We're not really growing. If we had population growth in the manner that Texas has, that Tennessee has, that Florida has, Washington State has, those individuals would be bringing their new ideas, their investment money, their tax dollars, all the things that help go into making a state successful. So you're talking about high-tech industries, absolutely they'd be more attractive, but it would also be more attractive for small businesses. It would also be attractive for a number of industries that instead of paying a 6% income tax rate, see the benefit in only having to pay a 4.8% tax rate, and over the long term, not having to pay state income tax at all. In fact, I'll point out one last thing. If this bill were to pass in its current format, of all of our neighboring states, with the exception of Tennessee, which doesn't have a state income tax, we would have the lowest state income tax of every state but Tennessee. So that puts us in a great position to compete. And when you have states like Illinois that are going in the opposite direction, they're following the path of more government, of higher taxes, it's going to make Missouri a very attractive option.